David, I mean, thank you so much. I mean, I haven't met you face to face, but it looks like, perhaps I've known you for years. I don't know. It's like one of those people, I've got a colleague here. I'm not sure whether you know him, someone called Carlo Morelli.
Uh-huh.
So Carlo Morelli is like, Carlo Morelli is like kind of, you remind me Carlo Morelli. So Carlo Morelli is like one of those good guys, It's like middle of the night, you can call him.
Right.
And then he will actually accept the call and say like, okay, what's happening? He said, Carlo, I've got my problem with my car. Car is not starting. He says, okay. And the Carlo says, yeah, I'm coming now. He says, Carlo, do you know about car? He says, no. Then why don't you come? so that's the communist, that's the way communists live their life,
Yeah, you're right. And it's a sensibility that you can feel sometimes.
Yeah, and I think these people are really important for, even for my like living here, in an unknown society, it's tough for me. But these people, gave me that safe space. And
Yes.
every day I kind of, try to be grateful what they gave to me. I mean, especially in the long lockdown situation, it's just really tough. These are the people, who have been there. We just like stuck together. And then, because my wife works in the NHS. So, from the very beginning, we were exposed to the whole concept.
Right.
So
Right.
it's like kind of thinking, oh my God, this is the end. And I have like two young children, so just last
How
3.
old are your kids?
So, I mean, they're grown up now. So the big one is like 17 and the small one is 14. So,
Okay.
so they lost.
Okay. Because mine are older, that's still not fully grown up in my book. So
Part of me also will try to speak about those things, about our memories, about, this coronavirus, how it affected everything, and then how we are living.
yeah.
And then, the other stories, the other show, it just goes on and on, isn't it? So the Tories, I mean, the Tories have been the most successful political party in UK's history. Because part of my life, I spent half of my life in Bangladesh. So I grew up, in that kind of society and then came here. And it's difficult, try to see through the empire,
Yes.
living with that empire. It's difficult. And then you can see if you open the newspaper or BBC, I don't see any change coming soon because these people are so powerful.
Yes. And also, and this goes back to what you were saying earlier about being connected with people that are just by disposition supportive, because in general, in the capitalist North, there has been such an atomization of people's lives that just the basic, I don't mean political solidarity, where you're acting in conscious solidarity. I mean, even basic solidarity on a day-to-day basis of community life has disintegrated. Especially because mass organizations of the left have deteriorated so terribly. There was a time when in every working class community, there were the activists and organizers of the unions and the parties of the left. And they did all that work that we now sometimes call mutual aid. Someone is being evicted, and all of a sudden they have a picket line of 40 people in front of that house. And it doesn't matter whether they knew them. These are working class neighbors who need to be protected against capital and the state. And all of those resources have gotten so weak during the neoliberal period that it really reinforces that sense of being atomized and powerless. We sometimes forget about all of those everyday qualitative forms of solidarity.
I mean, like just in front, because I live quite close to my campus, and it's just walking distance. And in between my house and the campus, I have to go through this food bank as well, where I see every day there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people there. But there's a nice cafe just beside that food bank, and sometimes we just sit there, and then try to like understand like what's happening there.
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel that I need to be in that line as well, just to show solidarity. But at the same time, I struggle that what does it mean, like do I
Mm-hmm.
really? Perhaps I'll be in the line, but I'll not take any food. I just want to be there to see, like, I mean,
Yeah. I don't think there's any easy solution
mm,
here. You know, Houston, where we're now living, is a fascinating multiracial city, big global city, and so on. Uh, but it's full of intense, heavily racialized poverty.
mm,
And of course, we try to support whatever social movements and participate in whatever struggles we can and so on. But there are times where you're literally reduced to giving $1 to somebody who's panhandling on a street corner.
mm,
And you know it's a mere band aid.
mm,
And yet, if it helps them get a hot meal, there's something that feels like that's the right thing to do, but at the same time, it feels so painfully inadequate.
mm, mm,
And I think in the absence of working class soup kitchens, for instance, that are politically organized and that sort of thing, we're just caught in this bind of always doing too little that's better than nothing.
mm.
It's tough.
When I was reading your book, you bring lots of historical characters, and you told the stories in a very in a powerful way, but also these are not easy story to tell. When you're talking about
Hmm.
people like Cicero, this like famous statesman, and then you are giving this picture that he's actually writing during that time. He was writing an email to his friend Atticus, that Atticus, I've got a good day today, and I've got this amount of money in front of me sitting. And then he told that it's not actually money sitting; these are the slaves in front of him. You talked about this thing in your different talk over the years, but that was a powerful story you told.
And I think those stories can be so important because often we're trying to describe these huge macro level social processes. And yet, if we can sometimes give a reader an entry into understanding those processes
Mm,
through what appears to be a very small everyday example, it can be, in some ways, it can connect more
mm,
than if I just tell you the size of slave markets in ancient Rome or something like that.
mm, mm,
Because all of a sudden, yes, a Roman statesman's reduction of people to money
mm,
and what he can get for them is just presented. So I think you're right that those can be very powerful ways
mm,
of communicating pretty large social and historical questions to people.
mm, mm. The book is about our, you know, the human bondage, the slavery, the colonialism. It's just pages after pages. And it's a difficult book to write as well.
You're right. And I think there's a very significant challenge to writing about these chapters in human history because you want people to understand the depth of violence that is associated with power and
Mm,
the power of money, as I call it, a technology of power in the book. And it's really important to try to get people to understand that money is not just this technical convenience. It's not an item designed to make merely the trading of goods and services easier, that it actually is a mechanism by which the powerful become ever more powerful, and through which they exercise power over common people. But at the same time, as you probe those dimensions of violence, colonialism, and the extermination of indigenous peoples, a transatlantic trade in human beings in which probably 1 or 2 million of these people simply died during the Middle Passage in the crossing of the Atlantic, and the recognition that the Atlantic Ocean is littered with the bones of enslaved people. And then to take that story into the immense wealth that bonded people produced for their rulers. It's sometimes not easy, and there are times where I think, as a researcher and a writer, you need to be very attentive to when you're getting numb from it. This is a sidebar, but I was at one point in a research library in Louisiana, in New Orleans, and I was reading in French bills of sale where enslaved people were being sold, and how much money was exchanged between who and who in order to transact the sale of this person. I just had to put the files away and get up and walk away from the table and so on. So I think the challenge is that you want readers to come to some appreciation of this embedded violence, that when they walk into a shop and they use a pound note or a dollar bill or a euro, that every now and then they get a glimpse of the histories of slavery, colonialism, and oppression that lie behind those notes. You want them to get a sense of that, but at the same time, you can't just overwhelm with endless stories of suffering. And so the challenge for me was to try to be truthful about that violence, while also always showing the cracks in the system through which, as they say, light gets in and hope stays alive. And even people in bondage fought back and resisted, and in some cases even overturned these structures of oppression. And so, hence the occasional allusion, say, to the Haitian Revolution and that sort of thing. I don't think any of us ever get this 100% right. I just hope that the reader senses a truthfulness and an honesty and a gesture of solidarity with those who suffered.
Because I really want to cover your book in a not in a systemic way, but more because I don't like kind of a scripted kind of discussion. So I kind of jump into the middle age, one of those two more characters you also mentioned about, Isaac Newton and John Locke. I was kind of naive, when I came to UK, and John Locke always because I was growing up in a country, third world country, lots of toxic politics there as well. Lots of bad books we have been reading as well. So this John Locke, John Locke is close to this America's idea of the America's dream. life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Great guy. And I was like, when I came to UK, and I actually tried to find where he was born. I actually went to that village, John Locke's village, and then and found some of those like remnants of the thing. But the more I actually try to know about this person, the more I feel detached from this guy, John Locke. I found that I've got nothing to do with this guy, because this guy has got no interest on anything to do with like in the society, community, the humanity. He's got serious interest in some other stuff. It looks like he's one of those enforcer for Isaac Newton, who was the kind of chieftain for kind of snooper force, like who's like forging mint. That's an amazing story. Can you just like explain to that story a bit more? I mean, for my audience, for my students.
Well, let's start with Locke and then go to Newton, because as you say, we are presented with Locke as the preeminent philosopher of freedom. We're presented with a Locke who is an opponent of arbitrary government and despotism. And of course, we find those passages in Locke where he's trying to stress that government must be a legitimate social power. But very often, Locke is read in a way where we miss that he is tying liberty to property in a way in which few philosophers had ever done before. And his fundamental concern with the arbitrariness of government is that it might violate the rights of the propertied, and in particular, their right to the free enjoyment of their property. Remember, of course, that the issue that ultimately triggers the Civil War in England is Charles I's attempt to impose ship money, ship taxes, without the consent of Parliament. And of course, Parliament was nothing but a congregation of wealthy landed gentlemen. And they were objecting to their wealth being taken from them for the king's military purposes without their consent. And so all of these issues of consent and legitimacy are really about government properly respecting the rights of men of property. And once we begin to read Locke in those terms, then things that legions of commentators either hushed up or said, well, these are just appalling contradictions we can't make any sense of. Now these things start to make sense, so that, I began to pick up in my research, well, if Locke was this great prophet of freedom, why was he an early investor in the Royal African Company, which was trading in slaves? Why did he co-write the Constitution of Carolina, in which slavery is legitimated, and in fact, in which Locke recommends, quote, the absolute power, unquote, of masters over their slaves? And so, for all the people who wanted Locke to be the great prophet of liberty, they had to somehow say, well, he was being inconsistent here. Unfortunately, he was a man who made errors, and so on. But what if, in fact, Locke thought this was entirely consistent? And as soon as we see property is at the heart of his philosophy, and particularly the idea that it is the liberty of the propertied, the property holders, that's really at stake, then, of course, they have the right to do whatever they want with their wealth, including apparently by human beings, because he's investing in slave trading. He is designing with his patron, Lord Ashley, who later becomes Lord Shaftesbury, he's designing a slaveholding colony in the Carolinas, and so on. So I wanted to demonstrate that rather than these being outlier themes in Locke's biography and in his political thought, colonialism and slaveholding were in fact entirely central. And once we read Locke in that way, you're right. He suddenly appears not as the magnanimous voice of liberty and human freedom, but as something much more sinister. Then we link in his friendship with Isaac Newton, because Locke plays a central role in getting Newton appointed as master of the English Mint, the London Mint, where coins are produced. And while this is a little bit of a plum patronage appointment, it's meant just to provide Newton with more wealth. It was a well-paid job, and you didn't necessarily have to do that much. Newton became obsessive. He was determined to stamp out so-called counterfeiting. Now, a sidebar on counterfeiting. It had been common practice in Britain for hundreds of years that coins were soft, and you could take a file or a knife and cut just a little bit of silver, gold, or copper off a coin. And if you did this every time a coin came through your hands, you could slowly build up small amounts of silver, gold, or copper that you could sell. Okay. And loads of poor and working class people filed away a little bit on coins. Okay. And Newton ramped up the prosecution of these people. And by the way, the death penalty could be called for people involved in messing with the coinage. And yeah, he was fanatical in this regard. Isaac Newton also invested in a slave trading company, the South Sea Company. And so now we've got the greatest English scientist of his age, and ostensibly the greatest English philosopher of his age, because you're talking about men who are living through the 1680s, 90s, and into the early 1700s, who are there as Britain is becoming the dominant capitalist power in the world. Britain is now has displaced Spain, it has displaced Holland, and now is waging 100 years of wars against France, in which it prevails to establish itself as the dominant imperial power and the dominant slave trading power in the world. And we discover that its leading philosopher and its leading scientist are up to their necks in all of it, in slave trading, in colonialism, in persecuting poor people who were simply trying to find a way to survive. And if you read, for instance, Locke's writings on poverty, he is for the harshest treatment of poor people. People who are begging without a permit, for instance, are to be subjected to the whip, have their children taken from them and put into pauper houses, and so on. And this is something that I think often intellectuals on the left don't spend enough time on. And I'll segue here just for a moment and then to come back to this. When Marx is writing about Thomas Robert Malthus, the political economist and population theorist, and Malthus is straightforward. The poor have no right to live. If they can't feed themselves, through their own earnings, they and their children deserve to die. Society has no obligation to them, says Malthus. And the great virtue of Malthus is he pulls no punches. Let them die, he essentially says. Now, when Marx is writing about Malthus, he's so angry. And at one point, he refers to his fundamental meanness. This is a cruel man. And cruelty is his signature as a political economist. And I think sometimes on the left, we want to be too accommodating to the protocols of mainstream scholarship and not actually call out this fundamental meanness and this cruelty. And so part of what I'm doing in Blood and Money is I talk in these ways about a philosopher like John Locke or a scientist like Isaac Newton, is I'm trying to say, look, they were part of a particular social class and its economic and political project. And cruelty towards the poor, cruelty towards people of African descent, cruelty towards indigenous peoples, this was all part of this epochal transformation by which capitalism became a global system. And let's not shy away from saying that. It's not unscholarly if we show the evidence to also call out that this is morally reprehensible. And when we look back at these thinkers, they can be called to accounts because their practices were deeply hurtful to the people of their age.
Because like I'm really kind of enticed to like say my story, one particular story. So we talked about, we are talking about this, like these are the people who brought like something called reasons, enlightenment, and all those things we talked about. So another enlightenment figure who's like a Scottish philosopher, James Mill. So James Mill is the father of John Stuart Mill. And when I was growing up in Bangladesh, we are like bombarded with like John Stuart Mill's like, philosophy and all those things. One thing I learned when I was teaching here and then reading quite a lot about these people, I found that James Mill actually wrote 6 volumes on India. He'd never been to India. He knew no one from India. So the book is not about India. The book was about actually against India, how bad the people they are, the weather is bad, the mosquitoes, it's just nasty culture, nasty religion, all those things. But the problem is that those 6 volumes were not innocent, because these are the books will be read by people and who will be subsequently posted in as a civil servant in India, as a colonial master. So these books dehumanized those people already. So that's why I kind of sense like why the violence is so, huge in those like, colonial setting, because, they already have this knowledge already about these people by this great scholar like James Mill. The good news for James Mill is he actually ended up having a job with East India Company. In today's money, that was £2 million a year. And then I tried to make a connection when I was reading a book that John Stuart Mill is actually a direct beneficiary of that money dripped with violence, dripped with colonial history.
And that's what you've touched on is so important, because sometimes we can take people to the explicit scenes where violence is committed. But very often in their texts, there's an invisibility to it. And so when you're describing James Mill's writings and John Stuart Mill's writings, which are ostensibly about India, but are really about British colonialism, in which the people of India are at best a passive backdrop in the story because the actors are British agents of the East India Company and of the British government, and so on. Right there, we are dealing with a kind of so-called epistemic violence, the violence by which you invisibilize people and you retell a story of a colonial enterprise in which only the colonizers matter. And every now and then there's a vulgar interruption because you have to say something about the people who you're dominating. But fundamentally, they are rendered passive, stupid, ahistorical, lacking intelligence, reason, and agency, and so on. And then, whenever you do when they do act, when they do rise up, say 1857 or something like that, now these same passive people become active in a certain sense, but as irrational hysterics, full of superstition, violence, and unreason, and therefore outside the projects of enlightenment, reason, and human freedom. And of course, this is done to indigenous peoples in the Americas in exactly the same way. So when they do force themselves out of invisibility, we now see how colonial writings essentially then construct them still as outside civilized standards in very, very, explicit ways. But the reality is that it begins with invisibilizing them. So to draw the parallel with Locke, Locke says to us, in the beginning, all the world was America. And what he means by that is, initially, all the world was uncultivated and unpopulated. Well, of course, there were millions of people there. But they have been, with this phrase, in the beginning, all the world was America, unpopulated, uncultivated, the land was available for whoever wanted it. We have the beginnings of the writing of a colonial project. Therefore, we can seize it. Therefore, we can take it because no one was there. And of course, we know how these legacies continue today, for example, with Palestine. And where the reality of the Nakba, the reality of mass displacement and dispossession is literally removed. And as a result, drawing attention to exactly what you were describing with both the mills is incredibly important, because that first move to invisibilize has in it a violent project. And so it's very, very important to draw attention to exactly those absences in texts that you were highlighting.
Because I think you kind of mentioned about these things. I think you use the phrase dialectic historical something, which is basically you cannot extract object from its history. Both are linked. So like these people, like John Stuart Mill, like Isaac Newton, so these are not like something abstract philosopher, or these are very much entangled with those like adventures in terms of slavery, colonial expansion, like rise of Bank of England, and like the mint and all those things. I mean, so it's kind of churning up. So I think, do you think the middle that time of our human history is quite special moment for this, like building up all those institutions for the rest of the human history, which we are still facing now. So like, tell us a bit more about, this Bank of England, 16.
Mm-hmm.
I've just written this so that I don't get the year wrong. That's 1689. So which will coincide with the people like John Locke, Isaac Newton. So these people are there, and that they're foreseeing this like nice institutions building up for them.
Yes. Yes, because once you have the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1689 in Britain, where finally we can say that the great men of landed property control the monarchy. And that's been their object throughout. This is what all the talk of legitimate government has been about. Not a government accountable to the people. If that were the case, the levelers would have won in the 1640s. This is a government accountable to men of property. But they've had to fight for that. And the story of the second half, really, of the 17th century in England, from 1642 to 1689, that story really is the story of the creation of a monarchy that will be accountable to the great men of property. Once you've got that, then they now want to empower their state militarily. They want to empower that state in such a way that it can win the ultimate inter-imperial battle, which is with France. As I was saying earlier, they have marginalized Spain and Holland by now. But imperial France, the absolute monarchy in France, is another story. And it's going to be 100 years of war after 1689. So they're trying to figure out what financial mechanisms they need. And 5 years later, by 1694, they have settled on this new proposal for the Bank of England. And you're right. I am really at pains in telling this story to try to assist the reader to see that this is not a benign institution that just created a new currency and made something called modern finance possible. What was its object? The Bank of England was a private consortium. It was a group of large investors who were going to provide a war loan to the crown. They were going to lend money so it could fight France. Because the problem for any government in this period is that war was extremely costly. And the initial mobilization of troops could clearly break an annual budget. You had to equip ships, you had to arm and put in uniform thousands and thousands of soldiers, sailors. You had to get them to the battlefronts. And these battlefronts were increasingly global. We have battles being fought in the Caribbean. We have battles being fought in Canada, and so on. And so this institution called the Bank of England, which, as I say, it's a private consortium, agrees to give a loan to the English monarchy so that it can go to war. It's a war loan. It's an institution for war finance. And over time, as it keeps providing loans, because as I say, Britain goes to war for essentially a century, 100 years with France. As it keeps giving those loans, the government keeps giving them more and more power, ultimately to the point that only they have the right to issue banknotes that can function as national currency. So you've got a private organization that's producing public finance and the public currency, all right? And then when you realize that their board of directors included some of the biggest slave traders in Britain at the time, everything starts to fall into place. This bank was created so that England, Britain could go to war to establish its colonial supremacy, which also included becoming the largest slave trading nation in the world. English ships would move more slaves than any other nation would move at the height from about 1750 onwards. No one could compete with the number of enslaved Africans moved on British ships. So all of this web of finance is fueling colonialism, war, the slave trade in bonded Africans, and all of these investors who make up the Board of Governors of the Bank of England are themselves entirely bound up with it. And in fact, our good friend John Locke reappears in this story because he's an early investor in the Bank of England. Okay, so I want people to see the Bank of England was not an innocent creation by a government that thought, oh, wouldn't it be more convenient with people if we had a central bank? Wouldn't this make life easier? Wouldn't it overcome the shortage of coins and so on? They were borrowing money from a largely unscrupulous bunch of private investors to finance wars that made British colonization more possible and made British domination of the slave trade a sure thing. And they knew what they were doing. They were conscious of all of this. And it meant that in the end, they became a private institution that performed all of these public functions, and all of its directors got immensely profitable through it. It was a profit-making institution. And very successfully so, because every time a working class person in London bought beer or soap or whatever commodity was being taxed, they were contributing to this war machine and the financiers who were profiting from providing the loans for it. So now we've got finance, empire, slavery, and the Bank of England at its heart. And as you know, this is not the story that is told about the emergence of these national institutions which had a global reach. There's a sense in which, therefore, we can trace back the stories that we know about organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and the damage that they do throughout the global South with structural adjustment programs. Well, all of the blueprint for all of this, if you will, the social historical DNA of predatory finance is all laid out with the Bank of England. And so it becomes this critical story, not just for understanding past events. These are institutional practices. Of course, they become more complex and sophisticated today, but these are institutional practices that continue to dominate our world.
I mean, I'll make a kind of outrageous comment. I mean, you might correct me, but I mean, apologies for that. So like, if I say like, if George Floyd were in that era during that time of Newton or like John Locke, I mean, he would have been executed by Newton.
That's true. That's true. And, you know, really interesting question in all of this is how many innocent people who took a counterfeited banknote unknowingly went to prison in Newton's day. You know, the fact that you or I end up with a phony banknote in our wallet doesn't mean we created it. Right? And this is something that hasn't been given enough attention in the George Floyd story. He passed a banknote that a clerk in the store was obliged to check. Okay, it was a condition of that young man's employment that he checked it. Okay, so now you've privatized essentially a police function. This is a point that the great Ruth Wilson Gilmore makes all the time, that the growth of policing includes the incorporation of policing functions into working class jobs, where someone like a clerk in a store is obliged to police the currency, for instance, and then obliged to call police if he believes he's received, in this case it was a he, a counterfeited banknote. And so all of that, as you know, kickstarts the Minneapolis police confrontation with George Floyd that leads to his murder. And the idea that having a phony $20 bill, for instance, somehow makes you a criminal, in a world in which these things are proliferating all the time, and you or I might pick up a phony banknote at any moment unknowingly in everyday transactions. We'll never know if, did somebody pay George Floyd with this, for instance, for an odd job that he did? Did he get it as change at the restaurant or what have you? So the idea that poor working class people will be punished when in fact there are these massive multinational money laundering operations going on out there all the time, and you don't know what you're picking up. But moreover, the George Floyd story forces us to ask an even tougher question, which is basically the question: is any human life reducible to a banknote? Because even if he knew, and we'll never know, but there's a very good chance he had no idea they had a phony banknote. But even if he knew, I want to say, and the force of Blood and Money is to say, that blood is precious in a way that banknotes can never be, and the wealth that lies behind them. There should be no possible equation between life and money. And for George Floyd to lose his life over a banknote passed quite probably innocently, but whatever the circumstances, it tells us once again about this inextricable link between blood and money. George Floyd died because of a social system more committed to the protection of the monetary currency than the protection of life. And that tells us everything we need to know about the priorities of our system. And so you're right. You jumped maybe some people would go, well, why is Abdullah all of a sudden talking about George Floyd? Well, you're talking about George Floyd because that question of blood and money is right there once again. It is no less on the agenda today than it was at a time when explicit trading in human beings was being justified by philosophers like John Locke. Those issues are still with us.
I mean, especially like after the death of George Floyd, the movement, the Black Lives Matter, and then the idea about defunding police force, it actually touches that very question that those like police force or the soldiers or the mercenaries, is the part and parcel of the violence, the structure.
No question. And I think you're right. You know, a lot of people imagine that somehow this growing sentiment, particularly among young people of color, that the only way in which racial oppression is going to be curbed in this society is by a systematic shift of resources away from policing. That sentiment has not disappeared. It has been politically attacked within the mainstream by Democrats as well as Republicans in the United States. But I think there's a profound intuition in the whole defund the police campaign, which speaks to precisely this question, the structures of violence that are used to reinforce the power of wealth, money, and capital. And the recognition that it is the policing of working class communities, particularly working class communities of color, which is the front line of the violence of oppression today. And so anything that is done to curb the powers of violence making is therefore to be recommended. And there are still millions and millions of young people in the United States who subscribe to this, even if for the time being their views aren't making the New York Times or what have you. And when you listen to the most thoughtful of abolitionists on this question, because in the United States, really, the contemporary form of abolitionist politics is police and prison abolition. And when you listen to contemporary abolitionists, you put them in a setting where they can just talk calmly. Their arguments win crowds because they start with the most commonsensical statements. They say, okay, let's agree that police should not be called to cases involving people with mental health problems. We want community health workers and social workers brought to interact with these people, not police, because a huge number of the people who die at the hands of police in the United States are facing mental health challenges. Let's also not allow police to interact with homeless people. Instead, let's have community housing workers and social workers come and interact with them. In each case, these people should be trained in de-escalation tactics. And if it takes hours and hours and hours to talk somebody down, thirdly, do not let police come and be the line of interaction with people dealing with drug and addiction problems. Again, have trained drug and addiction therapists and counselors, once more trained in de-escalation, dealing with them. Well, as abolitionists point out, you've now taken away 85 to 90% of the contact police have with the public. 85, 90% of what they do in a society like the United States is come down hard on homeless people, people dealing with drug and addiction issues, and people dealing with mental health challenges. So if you simply say we won't use police for any of these interactions, you can now get rid of 85% of the police budget and reallocate it to community health, housing, addiction counseling and treatment programs, and so on. So what I really love about this kind of case, as abolitionists lay it out, is they're essentially saying to us, there are very ready alternatives to the violence that police are inflicting every day, day in and day out in this society. And even if you believed, as I do not, but even if you believed that you needed police for those other 10 to 15% of cases, you would have massively reduced their interactions with oppressed people in this society. Because, Abdullah, it's important for people to understand that the police in the United States kill about 3 people per day. Like, as we're speaking right now, there's probably someone dying at the hands of police in the United States. This is the average. Well over 1,000 people a year dying at the hands of police in the United States. And so you're actually talking about saving an awful lot of lives when you talk about defunding the police. And so you're right. All of this discussion about how institutional violence is ingrained in this society has to open up conversations about what are the alternatives that people could actually push for and organize for. And so no one should be surprised that when something like, according to the New York Times, 26 million people took to the streets of the United States in Black Lives Matter protests in the 6 months after the murder of George Floyd, that defund the police was everywhere as a demand. And it's not going away. And it's not going away because none of the other so-called policies on offer, better training for police, and so on, better civilian oversight of police. This stuff has been going on for decades, and the death rates keep rising. Defund the police will continue to be there because it actually addresses the systemic causes in a way that nothing else does.
I mean, am I right to say that, no? Because if this movement gets success, the next move can be actually defund the army, the military force. Why do you need military force? Why do you need to? I think America's the biggest employer is Ministry of Defense. Millions of soldiers. I mean, why we need to raise soldiers for what?
Oh, and you've now hit on that point that is at the heart of Blood and Money as a research project, which is how war has been foundational to the rise of capitalism. And you're right. Any rational society would have to ask itself, why are military budgets going up at the same time as this year World Bank figures tens of millions more people will fall into absolute poverty? Absolute poverty is generally measured around $2 per day. Tens of millions are going to fall into that condition of absolute poverty, of trying to survive on less than $2 per day on this planet in 2022. And if anything most dramatizes the ultimately insane priorities of the system, it is that in the midst of that, the billions upon billions upon billions spent on soldiers and weapon systems just keeps escalating. You know, in the United States, there are 2 things you can count on there being more funding for at any time are the military and the police. Not healthcare, not education, the military and the police. This is what you can be really, really sure there will always be funding for in state and federal budgets. And that is the obscenity of the interest and power of money coming before human life. And so, yes, absolutely. In all of these scenarios, the question of the military, which is at the heart of the argument of blood and money, has to be front and center. How long can a society consider this to be so-called rational social policy?
Like, I mean, when I was, thinking and reading your book about, that moment with Cicero and Atticus. So like when like Ukraine war is happening, and then suddenly I saw that, Biden just authorized $93 billion for the war. It's again like the blood money is coming here, isn't it? And so am I right to say like he's seeing opportunity here? It's not like giving $93 billion. It's about his investment, isn't it? The private investment is coming for this war industry.
Right. Well, and this is the thing about, any conflict like this. And let me be clear. I do not support Putin's invasion.
No.
But what the United States wants to do is to essentially impose its agenda, because it's playing a geopolitical game in which it seeks to curb the power of China and Russia as alternative forces in the global order today. So its ultimate agenda is not about the people of Ukraine. Its ultimate agenda is about making sure that it manages to engineer a setback for one of its global competitors. In this case, Russia has to be called into line. But as you know, Putin made sure that he had at least tacit support from Beijing before his invasion. And so there's a game being played with China, a great power politics game being played there. And so, this makes it so complicated for us, because for those of us who recognize that people should have a right to self-determination, like the people of Ukraine, at the same time, we have to be so clear that in saying that, we do not support NATO expansion. We do not support the NATO powers using this conflict to promote their objectives, which they're trying to basically impose upon a conflict that's happening between Ukraine and Russia. So you're right. All of a sudden, money is there. Apparently, almost limitless amounts, not because of some inherent justice that they perceive to the cause of the people of Ukraine. If that was what was at issue, how about backing the civilian movement in Haiti right now? There's a lot of things that the United States is directly responsible, like the humanitarian crisis in Haiti. No. It's not got to do with the justice of the people of Ukraine. This is a great opportunity to prosecute their imperial objectives of securing supremacy as much as possible for the United States. So you're right. We need all the time to break through the rhetoric, because it is easy sometimes to impose a plausible rhetoric on an intervention. Say when Putin has done something outrageous in this case. But that doesn't mean that we should be buying that rhetoric. We need to be deciphering what the imperial agenda is that runs through and underneath all of this. And it's sometimes a challenge. What I'm hoping that a contribution like Blood and Money does is give people a kind of historical analysis where they don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time, because it makes them armed with, it gives them a certain kind of critical understanding of why empires act like this and what their real agenda is.
I mean, David, I'm aware of your time, so I'll take just last 5 minutes. I really
Sure.
want to bring Karl Marx, and then finish our talk with Karl Marx. So like Karl Marx talks about in this like dialectic thing, the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Can you be hopeful about future? Can you see any change? Just cannot carry on this. I mean,
I do see hope, and I say that not as a naive optimist. The state of the world is terrifying,
mm,
whether we're talking on the ecological and environmental front, whether we're talking military and war fronts, whether we're talking about the rise of right-wing authoritarianisms
mm,
in one country after another. The state of things is horrifying. But I think hope lies in the continual upsurges of resistance that refuse to be silenced and refuse to be squashed. I mean, I'll just give you a couple of small stories around the Black Lives Matter uprising here and then offer a couple of other global examples. But in Memphis, Tennessee, the city in which Martin Luther King was assassinated,
mm,
within days of George Floyd being murdered on the streets of Minneapolis, 6 girls, 15 years and younger, met online. They were predominantly young women of color, and they said, we have to do something. These 5 girls who'd never organized a demonstration before brought 10,000 people out into the streets of Memphis.
mm,
And you read the interviews with them, and you realize these are young people with all of the courage and determination of the civil rights and anti-war organizers in the United States in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s.
mm,
They're prepared to defy parents, police, teachers, and so on to stand up for what's right. Here in Houston, Texas, where George Floyd grew up,
mm,
60,000 people came into the streets. And the message was clear, particularly when Black cowboys on horseback rode through the crowd to cheers. The message was clear. We control the streets today.
mm,
Police had better back off because these streets are ours, and we're remembering George Floyd, and we're sending a message of Black Lives Matter. That movement may have receded because the Democratic Party played some very sneaky games to get that movement to demobilize prior to the election campaign, where they wanted everything to be Biden, Biden, Biden. But as that movement receded a little bit here, we then saw a wave of struggles in countries like Colombia, Chile,
mm,
Mexico, Argentina, that won reproductive justice for women, again, led by very, very young women.
mm,
I couldn't help but take inspiration from the farmers' movement in India,
mm,
which actually stared down the Modi government. And so I say all of that, Abdullah, not to be naive,
mm,
but for me, what this says is forces of resistance have not disappeared. Of course, I'd like them to be broader, better organized, with stronger links of international solidarity, and so on. But they are there. And so my attitude on hope, maybe this is a conversation we'll renew another time, but my attitude on hope really picks up from a term used by the German Marxist philosopher Ernst Bloch,
mm,
where he refers to militant optimism. And what he means by militant optimism is a refusal to give up hope so long as there is resistance.
Mm.
Because so long as there is resistance, then there are forces pushing for change.
Mm.
And our job as critical intellectuals, as intellectuals of the left and so on, is, I believe, to try to lend whatever resources and support we can to those forces of change, knowing that there are no guarantees, but they are the hope that endures in the midst of an awful lot of catastrophe.
Thank you, David.
Be well, Abdullah. It's great to meet you,
Bye.
at least virtually here.
Thank you. Thank you.
And do keep me in touch.
Thank you. Thank you, comrade.
Okay. Be
Bye.
well.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.